Welcome back to This Week in Immigration, our in-depth look at what really mattered this week in immigration policy. I'm Hunter Hallman. On the show this week, immigration in the courts, a new report on border metrics, and what's behind the decline in international students coming to the U.S. You can subscribe to this podcast and all of BPC's podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also stream on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org. And while you're there, you can find more information about all the topics we discuss on the podcast today. Just go to bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. Our guest today, first, as always, Theresa Cardinal-Brown, BPC's Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy, and welcome to Jake Varn, a BPC policy analyst, breaking out from his usual infrastructure beat to talk about immigration today.
Happy to be here.
And Josh Rodriguez, a research intern on our immigration team. Hello to all of you.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start today with immigration in the courts. Theresa, the Supreme Court recently declined to weigh in to overturn a lower court decision that continues the DACA program for now. Congress seems to have seen this as removing the urgency to act on a DACA fix. So what's the timeline for the appeals process, and what happens if the court decides the government can end DACA?
So the Supreme Court was answering an emergency appeal from the Department of Justice, asking it to weigh in before the appeals court in California had decided. And the Supreme Court said, we think we'll let the lower courts weigh in on this first. What that meant was that the injunction that the lower court had put in place that required the government to continue accepting DACA applications stays for now. The lower court is working its way now to determining the case on its merits, whether or not the government properly ended the DACA program when it announced the ending. That court case could run through the summer before we have a decision out of the appeals court in California. Probably the losing party will appeal that to the Supreme Court. If it comes during the summer, the Supreme Court won't decide till the fall, in its October term, if it'll take up the case. So this may go on through the election season into the fall of the year.
Okay. That sounds exhausting.
Yeah, legal challenges take a while. In the meantime, as you said, Congress seems to have taken this as a reprieve from having to deal with DACA legislation. There are some efforts still ongoing. Senator Jeff Flake introduced a bill and tried to get the Senate to consider it yesterday. He was not successful. And we understand that Senator Thune and some other Republican senators have another proposal that they're trying to shop around as an amendment or something maybe on appropriations. But frankly, a lot of the air has gone out of the balloon in Congress on this issue right now, feeling like, well, it's status quo for now, so we don't need to weigh in. That having been said, the DACA recipients are still feeling the pressure. They don't know now when the courts will decide and when their status will end. They are filing renewal applications, but not as many as a lot of people had hoped, so there may be people that are still losing their status.
So in a separate Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court had issued a ruling about the detention of immigrants in removal proceedings. Can you talk a little bit about what the question at the heart of that case was and what effect that ruling has?
Sure. So this is an interesting case. It's about whether or not immigrants who are being detained while they are in deportation proceedings are entitled to a hearing to see if they can get bond. In other words, like in the criminal court system, you can go in and you can see if you can get bail to be released from jail while your case is pending. The immigration process allows a similar thing called bond. The question arose because there were some courts in California, immigration courts in California, that were not granting immigrant detainees bond hearings, feeling that they weren't required under law to do so. Given that the immigration courts are severely backlogged, this means that these people were in detention sometimes a year or more before their cases were heard. So the Supreme Court looked at the law and said that they did not believe that the immigration law required a bond hearing in this case, that courts were not required under immigration law. But they told the lower court to go back and look at the case to see if the Constitution required that people be given an opportunity to ask to be released on bond. So they basically elevated it to a constitutional question rather than an interpretation of the immigration law, and we'll see where that goes from now. But this has some significant consequences, especially as we've written in the past, as you've written in the past, as the immigration court backlogs keep growing. Many of these cases are taking a lot longer, and the fact that the law doesn't require a bond hearing, it was written at the time when you could get an immigration hearing probably within 30 days. And so it wasn't a prolonged detention and a prolonged hardship for the individual and or their families.
So I'm just going to list a couple of other cases that are going on right now. The legal beat is keeping us extremely busy. We've got a decision that came out on the case on the border wall, a lawsuit over DHS policies separating families at the border, the evergreen travel ban cases that seem to be popping up left and right, and then late breaking news, we have the Attorney General's Jeff Sessions announcement that they will be suing California over sanctuary cities policies.
Yeah, it does seem on immigration everybody's suing everybody right now.
It does. It really does.
We'll start with the border wall. This is one that President Trump won. And interestingly enough, the judge who ruled on the case is the judge who ruled against him in the case over Trump University, the one who called the Mexican judge, Judge Curiel from Indiana. Basically, the state of California had sued the federal government over the building of the wall prototypes that the president is going to go visit this week. They claim that the administration violated environmental laws and regulations in waiving all of them to build these prototypes. And the judge basically ruled that nope, the law that allowed the government to waive all of those things was valid, and they did it properly, and so California could not sue them over building the prototypes. So California lost that one, and the Trump administration won that, and Trump tweeted out very clearly how happy he was that this judge now ruled in his favor. Go figure. Another court case that has just started, but we expect that could have a big outcome, is that the Department of Homeland Security apparently has started a process when they apprehend families at the border of separating the children from the parents for detention. And somehow they say that they're doing it in response to court cases that say they have to provide specific detention facilities for minors. And that a recent court case in California had said that if you keep the families together, the detention requirements for minors apply to the parents as well. So they're saying, well, in that case, we believe that we should separate them because we have two different detention standards.
And let me clarify on something on that really quick. We're not talking separating like different rooms or a couple of miles. No, this can be different states.
This can be different states, right. Yes, different facilities in different states. So this is creating, obviously, a hardship separating families. And so there is a court case that has been filed to prohibit this practice. And so we'll see where that goes. DHS means it, honestly, as a deterrent of a lot of these Central American families that are still coming in through the southwest border. And then, of course, the evergreen travel ban cases. We've talked about them in the past. The last ruling from the Supreme Court allowed the administration to go forward with implementing the majority of the travel ban, but the underlying cases about the legality of them in the first place are still making their way through the courts. So we have some interim decisions that we expect to be forthcoming on there. And then, as you mentioned, just today, the Department of Justice sued the state of California over 3 laws that California passed in the last year that make it a so-called sanctuary state. The 3 laws relate to a prohibition on private employers voluntarily granting ICE access to certain records or locations without providing notice to their employees. This happens when ICE is investigating employers for violations of employment verification rules or whether they suspect them of hiring undocumented aliens. A second law passed by the state says that this gives the state the right to inspect and review immigration detention facilities in the state. So ICE will contract both with privately owned detention facilities and state and local governments to house immigration detainees. And this gives the state the right to go in and inspect them, not just to inspect them, but to also ask whether or not the detainees are receiving due process and to look at federal records relating to these detainees. And the government says that that's not allowed either. And then the third is the California Values Act, and this is probably the one that most people are calling the Sanctuary Act, because it actively prohibits any state or local law enforcement agency from providing to ICE information about detainees and when they were released, people who they have in their custody, when they're released from custody. It prohibits them from transferring individuals into ICE custody, except when the individual has convicted of a very limited set of criminal acts. So it is a significant set of rules. The Justice Department is claiming that all of these rules are unconstitutional under the Supremacy Clause, which says that federal law enacted under the Constitution by Congress is the law of the land, and no state or state constitution can violate that. They argue that immigration law is passed by Congress, that immigration enforcement under that law is lawful, And 3 separate times, the lawsuit claims that California has no lawful interest in obstructing immigration enforcement, essentially claiming that California is acting against the law by passing these things. So this has now been taken up by a district judge in Sacramento, California, who's a George W. Bush appointee. We expect this case to move fairly quickly and almost certainly will be appealed. The California Attorney General, Javier Becerra, has already stated that they will fight it as far as they can. And so this is going to be a loud and noisy one, folks.
So do you think if this case is successful, the Trump administration is going to move on to suing a whole swath of sanctuary jurisdictions, or is this a specific case because it is a so-called sanctuary state?
I think this case is related to specific California laws that were passed, but they could have implications for other similar laws that other states have passed, much in the way that when the Obama administration sued Arizona over its SB 1070 immigration enforcement crackdown laws, other states that had passed similar laws either withdrew them or changed them because that court case influenced whether or not they were lawful. So I think that other states that have passed laws maybe similar to these, depending on how these court cases go, could find themselves rethinking that. I think the California laws are probably the most forward-leaning in terms of how much they restrict or prohibit people from helping ICE enforcement. So we'll just have to see how this one goes.
Great. Thanks, Theresa. Turning now to the border, Theresa, BPC has long called on government to better track and report the key metrics related to border security. Can you give us a little background on why this is so vital?
Sure. So for a long time in the immigration debate, there's been this idea that we have to secure the border before we can take any other action related to immigration, including whether we address the status of the undocumented. But nobody has a really good sense of what does it mean to secure the border. Are we talking about literally nobody can come across, or is there some metric that says we're doing a fairly good job of managing this? But the government over the years has not really helped us with this. They haven't provided consistent metrics of what constitutes effective border enforcement. The one thing they do count, how many people they arrest at the border, doesn't tell the whole story because they don't tell us how many people they don't arrest or who might get through. And that's really the thing that people are more concerned about. So when we look at border metrics, one thing we consider is how many different ways there are for people to come into the country, including between the ports of entry, at the ports of entry, and then we have to look at how many people are here at any given time, and that's a better picture. So we have worked with Congress, we've talked to the administration about how we can improve those metrics over the last few years, and they're starting to do that.
So now let's welcome in Josh Rodriguez to the conversation here as well. Josh, you recently wrote a blog post on a new DOJ-DHS report that actually seeks to report on some of these metrics that we've recommended. So can you go in a little bit to how our recommendations and the data in this latest report match up?
Yes. So this report really came out of a September 2017 report released by DHS with OIS support, which was named Efforts by DHS to Estimate Southwest Border Security Between the Ports of Entry. And within this report, DHS, using the methodologies given to them by U.S. Border Patrol, this report basically laid out the methodologies that Border Patrol was using at the border to collect border statistics, such as how many illegal immigrants are coming through the border, how many people are we catching at the border, what's the level of deterrence we have at the border, and other immigration statistics related to this. So using this report, I compared this report to a 2015 BBC report that we released that gave out some recommendations on how Border Patrol can improve their methodologies in collecting border statistics. So basically the gist of this report was comparing what these new methodologies being given by Border Patrol and this BPC report, where do they overlap, where do they diverge, and just to see if they are implementing any of the recommendations that we have or not implementing any of the recommendations, and what more could be done by Border Patrol and Homeland Security to give us more concrete information about what exactly is going on at the border.
So what's the importance of tracking data on what's happening at ports of entry?
the ports of entry are actually very important for tracking immigration data through the border. There's as we know, most of the either goods or people coming through the border are coming through the ports of entry. You're not hearing about hundreds of thousands of people who are going in between the ports of entry trying to climb over the fences or do stuff like that. They're coming in the legal way where most of our goods and people are coming through. So if we have methodologies being used at the ports themselves, we can get a more concrete understanding of what exactly is going on at the border. Because right now, this report that OIS released in September 2017 didn't talk about statistics being gathered at the ports. They only talked about statistics being gathered in between the ports. So we're getting statistics at the port themselves. It'll really help our understanding on what exactly is going on.
Can you tell us a little bit about migrant surveys and how they help paint a picture of what's happening at the border?
Sure, no problem. Migrant surveys are surveys that are, given to migrants, and they're asking about information that CBP would not really have jurisdiction over collecting. So one of the examples that the OIS report gave was smuggling rates. So what they talked about were in these surveys was they've been giving these surveys out for a number of years now, and in these surveys, as using an example such as smuggling rates, they're trying to figure out are there increases in smuggling rates? What are the differences throughout the years of smuggling rates? So using these surveys, Border Patrol is getting a more concrete understanding of information such as this. And using migrant surveys, they're finding out that smuggling rates have been increasing over the past couple decades because of increase in border security, and it's becoming harder for smugglers to get people from Mexico into the United States. So because of using migrant surveys, we're getting a more complete understanding about this metric.
You can also use migrant surveys in ways that Border Patrol won't know, such as the surveys in Mexico about people who are considering coming to the border. So that kind of gives an idea of what the potential migrant population is that we're trying to, and whether or not increased border security is actually having a deterrent effect. You don't know that unless you're talking to the migrants themselves.
So what else can CBP do to improve collection of data and reporting on border metrics?
So there's a couple things that this recent blog post mentioned about how CBP can improve their border statistics gathering. So right now, first, one of the recommendations that could be found in the report is that CBP can release their statistics and their border methodologies to private institutions, to academic institutions. So that these third-party groups can then use these metrics, use these methodologies to try to help or assist CBP in bettering their border statistics gathering procedures. Another recommendation that can be found in the report that can improve CBP's border metrics gathering is doing the same thing at the U.S.-Canada border. Because this report only mentioned the southwest border between the United States and Mexico. And of course, with changing demographics and changing just global system, people who are trying to get things into the country illegally would most likely try to go by the way of least resistance. And right now, that's the U.S.-Canada border. If you were to compare the U.S.-Canada border and the U.S.-Mexico border, it's not even close of the number of resources and the amount of personnel that we have on each border. So if we were to do the same thing with the U.S.-Canada border and find out how many people are coming in illegally that way, how much illegal contraband is being found coming in through this border, it'd be very, very helpful on trying to get a complete picture of our northern and our southern border on border statistics methodologies and what exactly is coming into our border so the entire nation could have a better understanding of what exactly is going on.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. And last but not least, Jake, you wrote a blog post for us recently on new data about how many international students are enrolling in U.S. colleges. So what are we seeing?
That's right. So a new report came out from the National Science Foundation, and they report that there are 32,000 less international students enrolled in undergraduate or graduate colleges in the U.S., which represents about a 4% decline within international students. And if you're combining a few other data sets tracking this number for the past years, this would be the first decline since 2005. international enrollment has steadily increased, as has a large portion of domestic enrollment. It's capped off in a few years, but international enrollment continued to climb. And so this was the kind of historic decline for the student body.
Do we know why enrollment is declining?
So we don't know exactly why, because it's a little bit of a soft statistic. You don't know exactly why someone wouldn't decline or wouldn't apply, or if it's less quality applicants coming in. But we do have surveys of the institutions themselves, and 68% cite difficulty with the visa process, with either delays or denials being a primary reason for why they saw declines. So we can walk through that a little bit of some of the visa issues, but essentially we don't have a hard sense of exactly why these numbers are down. We can just kind of guess based on these surveys.
So how much of this decline do you think can be attributed to changes specifically from the Trump administration?
So I guess we should start a little bit with the changes in the Trump administration. So some of it's been rhetoric that we've seen, where it's more the reputation of the United States that could be affecting this. And some of it's actually policy changes. Either the draft changes that have been suggested that international students would have to reapply every year, which means that they have to repay application fees, they have to have their paperwork in order, they have to, it might be dependent on their bank or the program they're in, getting all their paperwork in on time. That was a proposal that I think was leaked out in the summer that hasn't gone into effect yet, but that's one that could be on the minds of international students when they're applying. And then another one that has been in effect is the H-1B visa debate that's going on. And some education experts would argue that a lowering opportunity to transition from academics to the workplace would result in decline of international students coming to the U.S. Essentially, if you think of it, that if you are a Chinese engineering student and you're going to invest 4 years to either learn a language or learn a skill in a specific country, having the opportunity to then transition into working in that country would be much more valuable than having to then, relearn either a different system or a different language somewhere else.
So why does this? Oh, I'm sorry.
No. That's one side of it is the Trump administration and some of the Trump rhetoric around international students. On the other side, though, there are changes in the international just landscape. There were some major scholarship programs, Saudi Arabia and Brazil, to name two of them, that specifically sponsored a large percentage of international students to come to the U.S. And study. And those programs have either been canceled or changed dramatically. And so some of the declines could be directly attributed to that. There's also a rise in competition for international students as more universities are clamoring for them to try to have the best and the brightest students in the world. So that's some of the issues that could be driving this decline.
So tell us why this matters, both for the economy overall and for these colleges themselves.
Right. So on the economy side, the Association of International Educators estimate that international students provide roughly $37 billion annually to the economy. So it's
not insignificant.
Yeah, this is a big driver, because if you think about it, if you're an international student, you can't bring a lot of things with you. You have to buy them where you are. You're going to be needing transportation. You might be looking for food that you're familiar with. You might be driving an entire industry in a town. If you think of my alma mater, University of Iowa, the international students essentially represent anywhere from 5 to 10% of the actual city's population.
Wow.
So declines in that can pretty significantly change the landscape of the economy in that town. Mm-hmm. They also, the Association of International Educators also estimates that these students directly provide about 450,000 jobs per year. So $37 billion, 450,000 jobs across the economy. It's not small potatoes. For the institutions themselves, though, international students are extremely valuable, not only for their cultural significance to the campus lifestyle, but also they frequently pay out-of-state tuition at full sticker price, And then some universities also tack on international student fees ranging from $50 to $2,000 per semester.
Wow.
And so having a large international student body can help offset or keep costs lower for in-state populations. Something we looked at last year was the University of Purdue, which had implemented a tuition freeze for their in-state students. And you could argue that their extremely large body of international students and their fees for them help them do that, help them keep costs lower.
So one other thing I just might add in the economic thing that people forget about, foreign students who study in the United States are considered an education export for the United States.
Yes.
So if we're looking at trade balances with the rest of the world, this is a services export, and this is one place where we are growing our trade balance with every other country by having their national study here.
One thing I would also add is between the rhetoric and the visa declines, it does open the opportunity for countries around the world to increase the reputation of their universities. Just in the past decade and a half, we've seen China, Canada, and Russia all dramatically ramp up their enrollment of international students. So of the pool of international students, fewer are coming to the U.S. than are going to other countries compared to 2002. The U.S. still has the best universities in the world. We still have the best. We're flooded with extremely strong institutions, but this definitely it's 4% may not seem like a lot, but if this trend continues, it could spell trouble.
Thanks so much for being with us today, Jake. And that's our show for this week. Thanks for listening, and a special thanks to our producer, Gretchen Makins. Please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast as well as all of BPC's podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center and join us again next time.
And you can follow Theresa Brown on Twitter at
BPC_T Brown.
And Jake Varn at Jake Varn.
And Hunter Loy at Hunter Loy.